All right, let's dive into one of the biggest, messiest, and honestly most important conflicts in all of European history, the 100 Years' War. I know, it sounds incredibly complicated, but stick with me, and we're going to unravel this whole saga in just the next few minutes. Let's get into it.
So, first things first, and this is kind of funny, the 100 Years' War, it wasn't 100 years long, not even close. It actually raged on and off for 116 years. And this wasn't one single continuous war, oh no. It was a whole series of absolutely brutal conflicts, broken up by shaky truces and, oh yeah, a devastating plague, stretching across 5 entire generations of kings.
So, that's the big question, right? How on earth does a war drag on for that long? Well, the answer is an epic story about a crown, a very controversial claim, and the violent birth of 2 nations that we know today as England and France. And it all kicked off with a classic medieval crisis. The king died, and he didn't have a son.
Okay, to get our heads around this whole thing, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the claim that started it all. Then, the shocking early victories for England. We'll see how the tide slowly started to turn. Then, we'll meet the incredible, unlikely heroine who changed absolutely everything. And finally, we'll unpack how this monster of a war literally shaped the modern world. Believe it or not, this massive century-long war really just boils down to a family feud. A really, really big one. Back in 1328, the French king, Charles IV, died without a male heir. This threw the succession for what was then the most powerful kingdom in Europe into total and utter chaos.
Now, here's the twist. The closest male relative was, you guessed it, the King of England, Edward III. See, his mom, Isabella, was the dead French king's sister. But the French nobles, yeah, they were having none of that. So they dug up this obscure old rule they called Salic law, which basically said a claim to the throne couldn't be passed down through a woman. Convenient, huh?
And just like that, you've got the perfect setup for a massive war. On one side, England's Edward III, who has a seriously strong claim through his bloodline. On the other, Philip of Valois, a French cousin who was picked by French nobles because, well, he was French. At first, Edward kind of let it go. But then, Philip went and confiscated English lands in France, and that was it. Edward decided to press his claim again, only this time with an army at his back.
All right, so let's get into the fighting. The first phase of the war kicks off, and England, which was the smaller, less populated underdog, comes out of the gate with some brand new military tactics that just completely stunned the French.
You can really think of the whole war playing out in 3 big acts. First, you've got the Edwardian War, which was just one shocking English victory after another. Then comes the Caroline War, where France starts to desperately fight its way back into the game. And finally, the Lancastrian War, the dramatic final act that brings the whole thing to a bloody end.
The first huge shockwave hit at the Battle of Crécy. Picture this. The French roll out their superstars, these heavily armored aristocratic knights, basically the tanks of the medieval battlefield. They charge, but the English army, full of commoners, armed with this new superweapon called the longbow, just stood there and unleashed a literal storm of arrows. It completely shredded the French cavalry.
And then, just 10 years later, it's like déjà vu all over again at Poitiers. This time, it was even worse for France. I mean, truly humiliating, because their own king, John II, was captured right there on the battlefield. Think about that. The English hadn't just beaten the French army again. They were holding the King of France himself for ransom.
So after those kinds of losses, you'd think France is completely done for, right? But then something even more terrible than war shows up and hits the pause button. And in that pause, somehow, France begins this long, slow, agonizing crawl back from the brink.
I mean, you can't even imagine the devastation. The Black Death just rolls through Europe, wiping out maybe half the entire population of France. The war just stopped. It had to. There was literally no one left to do the fighting.
And if a catastrophic plague wasn't bad enough, France basically starts to eat itself alive. Their king at the time, Charles VI, had these terrible bouts of mental illness. At one point, he was convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. This left a massive power vacuum, and 2 factions of nobles, the Armagnacs and Burgundians, just ripped the country to pieces fighting for control.
For England, all this chaos in France, well, it looked like the perfect opportunity. A new, very ambitious English king,
Henry V, saw his chance to finally put an end to this thing by conquering France once and for all.
And that leads us to maybe the most legendary battle of the whole war, Agincourt. Henry V's tiny, exhausted, sick army gets trapped by a gigantic French force. And yet somehow, stuck in the mud and the pouring rain, the English longbowmen did it again. It was an absolute disaster for France.
Just look at this number, 40%. That's not just soldiers, that's the leadership of an entire country. Dukes, counts, barons, killed or captured. In one afternoon, France was on its knees. Henry V even forced them to sign a treaty, making him the heir to the French throne. It really looked like the war was over. England had won.
But then, just when it seems like all is lost for France, the most improbable hero you could ever imagine steps onto the scene. A teenage peasant girl from the middle of nowhere. She couldn't read, she couldn't write, but she claimed she was hearing voices from God, telling her to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc.
And the crazy part? She actually does it. In just a few months, she rallies this totally demoralized French army, breaks the decisive siege of Orleans, wins victory after victory, and marches the rightful French heir, Charles VII, all the way to Reims to be crowned king. She was a total game changer. She gave France hope again.
Now, Joan's story ends tragically. She's captured and executed by her enemies. But that spark she lit, it had already turned into a wildfire. The French regrouped, re-energized, and now they had a new weapon of their own, the cannon. The war that started with the English longbow finally ended with the roar of French artillery at the Battle of Castellane.
Okay, so after 116 years of brutal fighting, what's the final scorecard? Well, the impact of this war was way bigger than just deciding who got to be king of France. It fundamentally reshaped both England and France, setting them on the path to becoming the countries they are today. First off, warfare itself was never the same again. That whole idea of the chivalrous knight in shining armor, yeah, that was over. A peasant with a longbow or a guy with a cannon could take him down easily. This totally broke the old feudal system of raising an army and forced kings to start building the first professional state-paid standing armies, basically the ancestor of every modern military.
But honestly, this is the most important part. Before this whole thing, an English noble and a French noble were kind of like cousins. They spoke the same language, French, and had more in common with each other than with the peasants back home. But after a century of fighting each other, they started to think of themselves as English and French. France came out of it a strong centralized nation, and England, having lost its empire in France, turned inward, which helped kick off its own civil war, the famous Wars of the Roses.
So in the end, the 100 Years' War was so much more than a family argument over a crown. It was the fiery process that melted down the old medieval world and forged two of Europe's most powerful nations. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? What is it that actually makes a nation? Is it just a line on a map and a shared language? Or is it the shared memory of a long, bitter fight for the right to exist?